You're going through logical reasoning, things are moving good, you found a rhythm, you're reading, predicting, eliminating, you feel in control. But then a parallel reasoning question shows up and your internal monologue instantly shifts. Wait, why is this so long? What is this even asking me? And why do all 5 choices look kind of right, but also kind of wrong? You stare at the screen, your eyes glaze over, you reread the stimulus 3 times, but nothing is sticking. You're now 2, 3, maybe even 5 minutes into this one question, and you haven't even touched the answer choices yet. Panic sets in. You rush. You pick something that feels okay, and you move on, but you're still rattled, and the next question suffers for it. This is the parallel reasoning trap. It doesn't just burn time, it messes with your focus, your pacing, and your confidence. And here's the thing no one tells you. Parallel questions aren't hard because they're complicated, they're hard because they look complicated. The language is abstract. The sentences are long. The choices are full of recycled LSAT buzzwords, and there's no clear shortcut unless you know exactly what to look for. That's why most test takers either guess or get these wrong, not because they're incapable, but because they treat these questions like regular arguments, when in reality, these require a totally different skill, structural thinking. But the good news is that parallel reasoning is not about being fast. It's about being precise. And once you train yourself to see the patterns behind the noise, these questions become not only manageable, but actually kind of mechanical. You don't have to feel it out. You don't need to memorize arcane logic terminology. You just need to know how to break down the argument into its basic parts, recognize the kind of logic it's using, and match that structure, not the topic, in the answer choices. And that's what I'm going to show you step by step. Because once you build this skill, parallel reasoning becomes one of the most predictable, consistent, and score-boosting question types on the LSAT. Now let's get clear on what you're actually being asked to do. Parallel questions are not asking you what an argument means. They're asking you, what kind of reasoning is this? And which of the 5 choices uses the same kind of reasoning? It's like a matching game, but instead of matching shapes or colors, you're matching logic patterns. Think of it like this. You're not comparing the paint job on 5 different houses, you're comparing the blueprints. It doesn't matter if one's a beach house and the other is a log cabin. If they're both 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, with a kitchen on the left and the living room on the right, that's a match. Same logic here. Let's walk through a simple example. All employees who meet deadlines get promoted. John meets deadlines, therefore John gets promoted. You recognize that? That is conditional reasoning. If X, then Y. X is true, so therefore Y must be true. It's clean, it's valid, with no holes in the logic. Now, compare it to this. All plants that receive sunlight grow. This plant receives sunlight. Therefore, it grows. Totally different topic. One's about jobs, the other's about plants. But logically, they are identical. Same pattern, same reasoning. That's what the test is checking. Can you spot the structure? And here is where most people mess up. They look for the choice that feels similar. Oh, this one also talks about people getting promotions. Or this one matches deadlines too. That is the wrong approach. The test writers are counting on you to fall for the topic trap. They intentionally include tempting wrong answers that talk about similar ideas, but use different reasoning. Your job is to cut through that. You're looking for the same type of conclusion, whether it's strong or weak, whether it's conditional or moderate. You're looking for the same kind of logic, causal, comparison, or flawed, for example, and the same level of validity, whether it's flawed or it's valid. That is it. Forget the content, forget the phrasing, forget the emotional pull. Strip the argument down to its bones and match structure to structure. Once you start training your brain to think this way, you'll stop seeing these questions as confusing walls of text and start seeing them for what they are. Highly formulaic puzzles with one clear right answer. Now let's slow down and talk about what actually needs to happen when you first look at a parallel reasoning question. You don't jump to the choices. You don't start scanning for keywords. You analyze the stimulus like a lawyer breaking down a contract. First, you find the conclusion. Ask yourself, What is the author trying to prove? This is not always the last sentence. Sometimes it's in the middle. Sometimes it's disguised with soft language like, this suggests or it follows that. Be precise. Is the author saying that something must be true? That something probably is true? That we should do something? Get clear on the tone. Is the conclusion strong? Is it moderate? Or is it prescriptive, like you should or ought to do something? This matters because later, when you're eliminating choices, a mismatch in strength is enough to kill a choice. Then you ID the premises. You're asking what reasons or evidence is being used to support that conclusion. Circle it mentally. Is it facts, opinions? Is it data? Is it hypotheticals? Does it actually support the conclusion? The point here isn't just to read. It's to reverse engineer the reasoning. You want to see how the author moved from the facts, the premises, to the claims, aka the conclusion. That is where the structure lives. Then you diagnose the logic. You're asking, is the reasoning valid or is it flawed? This part is essential. You're not just understanding the stimulus, you are classifying it. Why? Because if the original argument is flawed, the correct answer will be flawed in the same way. And if the original argument is valid, the right answer must also be valid. For example, suppose you had an argument saying, all red cars are fast, all blue cars are slow. This car is purple, therefore it must be of average speed. Let's break it down. Strong, universal statements, all red cars, all blue cars. You have a new category, purple, that was not addressed in the premises. The conclusion assumes mixing fast and slow gives you medium. What's happening here? Of course, the logic is flawed. There is no valid rule saying that blending two categories gives you something in the middle. That is a common reasoning flaw. Now, here's what you write in your notes. The argument makes two absolute claims. Then it introduces a third item that partially overlaps. Assumes it must fall in the middle. This is invalid logic. Boom, that is your blueprint. When you look at the choices, you're looking for that exact skeleton. Nothing more, nothing less. Of course, you don't need to memorize every type of logical flaw on Earth. You've just got to see the steps the argument took and decide whether those steps were solid or shaky. That's what this is all about. Building a mental model of the argument so you can match it later with laser precision. Now that you've broken down the stimulus, the conclusion, the premises, the validity, it's time to zoom in and ID what kind of argument you're dealing with. And this is where most people skim and guess. But if you take 10 extra seconds here to get specific, the choices become way easier to navigate. Here is exactly what to look for. First is their conditional logic. You're looking for indicators like if, only if, unless, all, none, and whenever. These words tell you you're dealing with a rigid, rule-based structure. For example, if a student studies hard, they will pass the exam. Jake studied hard, therefore Jake will pass. That is conditional reasoning, and the right answer must also use conditional reasoning, not causal logic, not comparison, and not correlation. If there's a mismatch, you want to eliminate it. Then you're asking, is the argument causal? Instead of rules, causal arguments are all about relationships, like X caused Y, or X leads to Y, or if we remove X, Y will stop happening. This is softer than conditional logic, and it's easier to challenge. For example, you have an argument saying, sales dropped after we changed the website layout. Therefore, the new layout caused the drop in sales. This is causal reasoning. It's not airtight. It could be flawed depending on the context. So again, you're asking, is this argument structured around causation? If yes, you've got to match it with another causal argument, valid or flawed, depending on the stimulus. Next, you want to ask, are there comparisons? These show up a lot in flawed reasoning. For example, this policy works better than the old one, or company X pays more than company Y. Comparison arguments often involve analogies or value judgments. They require matching not just the tone, but the comparison structure. If the stimulus says, just as A behaves like B, so should C behave like D. You're looking for that kind of analogy in the correct choice, not just the words, but the entire setup. Now, you also want to ask yourself, is there a flaw? And if so, what kind of flaw? and this is critical. Go back to your analysis from step 1. Ask, is the argument making an assumption? Is it jumping from correlation to causation? And is it introducing new terms in the conclusion that weren't in the premises? If it's flawed, your correct answer must have the same flaw. Let's return to our earlier example. All red cars are fast, all blue cars are slow. This car is purple, therefore it must be of average speed. This is a false compromise flaw, assuming that two extremes average out when they're combined. You're now on the hunt for another argument with two absolutes, a middle ground case, and a flawed moderate conclusion. You're not looking for another question about cars. You're looking for that same structure. Now finally, tone and certainty matter, and this part is often missed. Ask yourself, is the conclusion stated as a fact, or is it a possibility? If the original argument ends with therefore X must be true, you can immediately eliminate any choice that says X might be true. A tone mismatch means there is a structural mismatch, which means you can eliminate it. Bottom line, when you ID the structure, conditional, causal, comparative, or flawed, you now have a filter for the answer choices. That is the power of this process. It turns 5 lookalike choices into a process of elimination where only one survives the cut. Now here's where most people blow it. They get through the stimulus. They think they understand the argument. Then they hit the choices and they panic. They read every word of every answer. They overthink. They second guess. They say things like, this one kind of sounds right, I think. Or, wait, maybe this is similar? It's about cars also. That's not strategy, that's gambling. So let's fix that. Here's how to approach the choices. First, don't try to understand every choice. Your goal is not to understand each answer. Your goal is to find the one that matches the argument's structure and eliminate the rest fast. Think sniper rifle, not butterfly net. You already know what the correct structure looks like. Use that to knock out choices that don't fit. And start off with the conclusion. That is the fastest shortcut. Scan the conclusion of each choice before you even read the full thing. Why? Because if the conclusion of the stimulus is strong and the answer says something weak, that's an automatic mismatch. You can eliminate it, and you don't even need to read the rest. It doesn't matter if the rest of it's perfect. If the conclusion doesn't match, it's out. Same goes the other way. If the stimulus had a moderate conclusion and the choice has a bold conclusion, you can knock it out also. You are eliminating for structure, not for the story. It doesn't matter if the topics are similar. If they're not flawed in the same way, if they make a different leap in the choice than from the stimulus, then you can knock it out. And if you are in doubt, go back to the premise conclusion structure. If you're stuck between two choices, you're going back to basics. What was the structure of the original argument? What was the relationship between the premises and the conclusion? Does the choice show that same relationship? 9 times out of 10, one of the two will be clearly off once you stop looking at content and focus on the logic. So to break this all down again, don't read all 5 choices word for word. Scan the conclusions first and eliminate mismatches. Ignore the topics, look for reasoning patterns. Match valid with valid and flawed with flawed. This is when the test becomes mechanical, not emotional, not intuitive, not artistic. And that's a good thing, because when something is mechanical, it becomes trainable. And if it's trainable, you can boost your score every single time. By now, you know how to break down the stimulus. You know how to ID the structure. You know how to eliminate choices like a sniper. So what's next? Let's take this up a level, because if you want to crush parallel reasoning, not just get by, you need tools that separate you from the average test taker. So here's how to do that. First, you want to abstract the argument immediately. This is the single highest leverage skill you can develop for logical reasoning. After you read the stimulus, ask yourself, what is the most stripped down version of this argument? You're not looking for the topic. You're looking for the way the logic moves. So let's practice. If the stimulus says, if a company raises prices, it will lose customers. This company raised prices, so it will lose customers. Don't even think about the company. Think like this. If X, then Y. X happened, so Y must happen. That's your blueprint. Now you use that to filter answer choices. If a choice doesn't follow that structure, it's gone. Doesn't matter how pretty it sounds. Then you use structure snapshots as mental shortcuts. Over time, you're going to see the same structures on the LSAT repeating themselves. There is not some infinite set. It's the same 10 to 15 logic templates recycled in different disguises. For example, all A's are B's. C is A, so C is B. This is valid universal logic. Or if they say most A's are B's, C is A, so C is probably B, that is a moderate inference. And if they say X caused Y, we changed, so Y changed, you're looking at causal reasoning. So every time you do a parallel reasoning question, ask yourself, what structure snapshot is this? Name it, label it, build a connection in your head. The LSAT is not creative. It is predictable, so you want to treat it that way. You also want to be able to knock out 3 of the choices right away without even reading the entire thing. You just don't have time to read all 5 choices word for word, so you shouldn't even try. You should really be able to knock out 3 of them almost immediately by looking at the tone of the conclusion, the type of logic, and the presence or absence of a flaw. When you train this skill, it changes everything. You will stop burning 5 minutes on these questions. You'll cut it down to 90 seconds, 2 minutes max, without rushing. That means more time, more focus, and more energy for the rest of the section. Now, don't sort of match the logic between the stimulus and the choices. Make sure it is exact. And this is where high scorers separate themselves. Average scorers say things like, well, it's kind of similar. But top scorers, 175 plus, they say, nope, it is not the same flaw. It's a different type of conclusion, eliminated. There is zero room for interpretation here. The right answer will match the structure exactly, not just in idea, but in the function of the logic. So when you feel tempted by an answer that's close enough, that's a trap. Close means it's wrong. Now, for the next level, you can build your own drill set of flawed arguments to go beyond passive review. Every time you do a parallel question, especially one with a flaw, write it down in your own words. Then write your own argument that matches it. Literally make up your own version of the same structure. This rewires your brain to think like the test makers. And once you do that, these questions stop surprising you. You're not playing catch-up anymore, you are anticipating. At the advanced level, this becomes a game of abstraction, pattern recognition, and ruthless elimination. It's not about being smarter. It's about training your brain to look past the content and focus on the structure with speed, precision, and confidence. Now that you know how to break down the argument and filter the choices, we've got to talk about the minefield. Because even if you know the right steps, the LSAT is still designed to trick you. The test makers bake in choices that look tempting, but are dead wrong. Let me walk you through the 3 most common traps students fall into and how to spot them instantly. The first trap is the topic match trap, and this is the easiest one to fall for. You see a choice that talks about the same subject as the stimulus. Maybe it's about companies or hiring or environmental policy, just like the original argument. And you think, oh, this must be it. It's about the same thing. Nope, that is the bait. Parallel questions aren't about what the argument's saying, they're about how it's saying it. The topic does not matter at all. The stimulus could be about astronauts, and the right answer could be about pizza toppings. It doesn't matter. So if you catch yourself thinking, this one's about the same thing, stop. That is your brain reacting to the surface, not the structure. Ignore the subject and focus on the skeleton. The second trap is the reasoning mismatch trap. This is another sneaky one. Let's say the stimulus uses conditional logic, if X, then Y, and one choice uses causal logic, X caused Y. At first glance, it might look okay, but underneath, these are different kinds of reasoning. Conditional logic is black and white. It's rule-based. Causal reasoning is softer. It's based on observations and often flawed. If the argument uses one and the choice uses the other, that's a mismatch. Doesn't matter if both of them sound logical. Doesn't matter if both of them lead to a similar conclusion. The type of reasoning must match, period. Always ask, is this the same type of logic as the stimulus? If the answer is no, eliminate it. The third trap is the silent killer, the validity mismatch trap. You get the reasoning type right, you get the structure right, but you miss the flaw or the lack of one. Here's the rule. If the stimulus is flawed, the right answer must be flawed in the same way. If the stimulus is valid, the right answer must also be valid. There is no room for debate here. The test makers love throwing in answers that match the structure, but don't match the level of reasoning quality. It's like giving you the right building plan, but using the wrong materials. Looks good on paper, but it won't stand up. So always ask, does this argument fall apart the same way the stimulus does? If the stimulus uses a false analogy, the answer should too. If the stimulus is airtight, the answer should be airtight. No mixing and matching allowed. Now here's a bonus trap for you, the language reuse trap. And this one's a bit more subtle. Sometimes the LSAT will copy-paste key phrases from the stimulus into a wrong answer to make it feel familiar. For example, the stimulus might say, it follows that the company should, and one of the answers might say, it follows that the government should. Same structure? Not necessarily. But the language feels right, and that's the trap. Don't let familiar wording override your structure analysis. When in doubt, ignore the phrasing. Strip it down and test the logic. Bottom line, the wrong answers are wrong on purpose. They are designed to exploit lazy thinking, fuzzy logic, or surface-level reading. When you slow down and check for topic distractions, logic mismatches, validity mismatches, and language tricks, you build a mental filter that keeps you from falling into the traps that derail everyone else. These traps account for the vast majority of student mistakes on parallel reasoning. Once you can spot them, you're ahead of the pack. But let's zoom out for a second. You might be thinking, okay, I get how to solve these, but why are we spending so much time on one question type? The reason is parallel reasoning questions are more than just another box to check. They are a litmus test. The LSAT isn't just testing whether you can memorize rules. It's testing whether you can think like a lawyer. And parallel reasoning is one of the clearest windows into that. And the skills you build here apply to most of the other question types in logical reasoning as well. And parallel questions train structural thinking, which is the number one skill you need in law school. In law school, the content doesn't matter as much as how you think about that content. You're going to be handed hundreds of pages of readings, dense, technical, full of case law and old legal jargon. Your job, of course, is not to memorize all of that. Your job is to extract the structure of the arguments. Who said what? Why? What rule was applied? And what assumptions were made? That is exactly what parallel reasoning trains you to do. To strip away the surface-level detail, to zoom out to the logic, and to spot patterns and match them across examples. This is why legal writing is full of phrases like similarly situated parties, by analogy, and precedent. It's all about matching structures, not substance. Parallel reasoning is like law school prep in disguise. Now let's talk real test day impact. Parallel questions tend to be long, dense, and slow. If you don't have a system for them, they become vampires sucking up your energy and time. They chew up 5 minutes, drain your confidence, and derail your pacing for the rest of the section. But if you do have a system, they become one of the most predictable question types on the test. Why? Because, of course, they don't require outside knowledge. They don't rely on subtle wordplay or tricky new concepts. They follow set structures again and again and again. Once you know what to look for, it's just a pattern matching exercise. You're solving puzzles, not improvising. And that means faster decision making, better timing, and more mental energy to spend on tougher curveball questions. And of course, logical reasoning is now 2/3 of the LSAT. You already know this, but let me drive it home. Because logic games are gone, logical reasoning is now 2/3 of your score. Every edge you gain here pays off more than ever. If mastering parallel reasoning gets you 2 extra questions per section, that's 4 more questions across both logical reasoning sections. And that right there could be the difference between a 167 and a 173, and that becomes the difference between a full ride and 6 figures of debt. And parallel reasoning, as I said, it builds transferable skills for other question types as well. Once you get good at identifying argument structures, you start seeing it everywhere. In flaw questions, in strengthen and weaken, and even in reading comp, especially those comparative dual passages. Parallel reasoning is like weight training. It's not about the one rep, it's about how that strength carries over everywhere else. If you can spot flawed comparisons or false cause logic in these questions, you'll recognize it faster in every other logical reasoning question type too. You become a better, faster, more accurate test taker overall. So this is not just about solving some niche LSAT question. It's about building the muscle of thinking like a lawyer. It's about managing time and stress under pressure. It's about compounding small wins into a massive score difference. That's why parallel reasoning matters, and that's why it's worth mastering. So if you want to win at parallel reasoning, stop treating it like every other logical reasoning question. This is not about content. It's not about what sounds right. It's about one thing: structure. You're matching the logic, not the language. So you want to break down the stimulus, ID the reasoning type, spot the tone, build a mental blueprint of the logic, and use that to eliminate answer choices that don't match. Then, watch out for the traps. Same topic does not mean same reasoning. Trust the structure, ignore the story. If you do that, you stop bleeding time, you stop guessing, and you start scoring.